Good morning, Grace Point. Oh yeah, we're here, we're ready. Those of you watching online, thank you for joining us. Thanks for being here. Those of you in person, thanks for weathering the storm. Here's how I know Pastor Matt is more sanctified and a better person than I am, because he just thanked God for the snow. He's an awesome human being, which we did need the moisture, so it is good. I'm excited about this morning for a couple different reasons, but I want to start with this. When's the last time you had someone ask you, hey, do you want the good news or the bad news first? And I try to think of those moments where that's been asked to me. And in recent history in my life, this has been usually like at a restaurant where like the bad news is they don't have fries for my burger, but the good news is they have cheese balls, which is actually better news. And I realize, and I know this, that there's moments in my life when I get this question asked to me, I immediately, because of my personality and my I think experience in life, I usually think I want the bad news first. Like, give me the bad news, then I could try to swallow it and digest it. And then because you said there's good news too, so I'm assuming the good news is always going to outweigh the bad news. And the reality is that when we have these moments, that's not always the case. And maybe for some of you, maybe you want the good news first, so you can kind of, just get that experience and then step into maybe what the bad news may be. And I think depending on our experience, depending on who we are and how we answer that question, I think is a little bit dependent on our response. But usually, I think I want the bad news first, but especially when it's deep or it's heavy, and it's more than just what's not available at a restaurant, the bad news can be consuming. To the degree in which I can't even fully hear or comprehend or remember what the good news is, even though I have both pieces of information. And there are moments in our life where we hear some bad news, even though there may be some good news attached to it. And I think why, at least for me in my experience, this is really tough is because I'm a very emotional person. I tend to feel things deeply. And if the bad news is bad enough, it will overshadow the good news because it takes a while for my emotions and my heart to catch up to my mind and my understanding of really what is happening in the situation. I think this is what happened with the disciples. In Matthew 17, we get to this moment where Jesus, for the second time, predicts his death. He is setting up for the disciples what is ultimately going to happen. So he gives them clarity on what is coming in the future, and yet there's this moment where the disciples hear both good news and bad news, and what overshadows the whole thing, what speaks into their experience and what they're feeling in the moment, all they can focus on is the bad news. Jesus gives incredible clarity, and he's incredibly specific and straightforward with what he tells the disciples. He said, I'm going to be handed over to suffer and to die, but we'll be raised. He says, we'll be raised 3 days later, yet the weight of the bad news overshadows any aspect of the good news still in what Jesus tells them. So last week, we started the sermon series just as he said, and Pastor Matt took us through Matthew 16, which is the first of 4 predictions in Matthew at Jesus, or the first of 4 times that Jesus tells the disciples, hey, he's going to go die, but then 3 days later get raised to life. And as we started this series, and the whole thought process behind what we want to do leading up to Easter is give some understanding of why the cross was necessary. What about the cross? What about that plan and that decision from God was the way in which he would go about saving and redeeming and restoring the world, reconciling people back into relationship with God. And so last week, Pastor Matt started off with opening this series and helping us understand the weight and heaviness and the reality of sin. That sin entering the world was a reason in which the cross was necessary because sin had to be dealt with. And he helped us understand that sin is more than just mistakes that we make, but they're conditions that really shape how we not only view the world or see the world, that shape the world itself, but shape the choices that we make. It not only sin fractures our relationship with God, it distorts any ability for us to be able to really make good decisions for our betterment and for God's glory. And so God doesn't ignore it, and he chooses to deal with the issue of sin. So he broke that down so well. And as we go through the next 3 weeks, as we lead up to Resurrection Sunday, to Easter Sunday, we want to continue to speak into this question, okay, why is the cross important? Why does it matter? And as I was prepping this week, I noticed something in the statement. You can go ahead and throw up actually Matthew 17. I noticed something in here that I think helps relate to my experience as a follower of Jesus. And so this is the word of the Lord. This is Matthew 17, verses 22 through 23. This is the second time that Jesus is predicting his death. And he says, when they came together in Galilee, he said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life. And then this sentence I just couldn't let go of, and it says, the disciples were filled with grief. And so as I was going through the week, I thought that for some reason I just felt led to, we're just going to sit in that statement a little bit this morning. And so next week, we're going to talk more about Jesus going to the cross and the reality of how Jesus' death on the cross and his bloodshed on the cross paid for our sin and forgave us. And in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about how the bloodshed on the cross actually brings not just forgiveness, but freedom and deliverance into aspects of our relationship with God, where we are not only forgiven our sin, but we are set free from sin by the power of God. And that's why the cross is necessary. But today, I wanted to have us just sit in a little bit of the idea that sometimes when things don't go as planned or things don't go as we assume or expect, there's massive disappointment. There's this reality of what, Jesus is giving them clarity on the future. And how often do we in our life want clarity on what is going to happen next? Because we think for some reason that is going to be more helpful. And yet there are moments that even in the clarity that he gives them, here's what's going to happen, I'm going to die, but I'm going to be raised, there's still this wrestling that we have to do when we go through moments of maybe pain or disruption, when things aren't going the way that we think they should go. So the big idea for this morning, what I want to wrestle with today and what I want to walk through today is this, is that following Jesus means learning to trust God's purposes even when the path leads through suffering. I want to talk about this idea this morning that suffering was not only a necessary component of how God chose to go about saving the world, it's Jesus and the disciples in this story, I think, give us an understanding of how we ourselves can kind of walk through pain and suffering and disappointment. So this is point number one. Number one is Jesus often reveals a path that challenges expectations. Jesus often reveals a path that challenges expectations. And I think I love talking about expectations so much. We do staff lunch every month, and we talked through this idea of unmet expectations and healthy expectations. And the reality is we all carry some aspect of expectations in our life and assumptions that we make. Assumptions are either we read someone's mind and know what they're thinking or think we know what they're thinking. Expectations are, I have an expectation on what I think is going to happen. And a lot of our frustration and distress and disappointment, especially in relationships, happens because of unmet expectations. And some of those expectations that we have and that we hold are really obvious and are not bad, are actually really, really healthy. But some are like hidden, subconscious expectations that we have about how we think life should go, or how we think like walking with Jesus should look, or how we think marriage should look, or how we think parenting should look. And then all of a sudden we have to examine once disappointment or frustration happens because those expectations are met. We have to relook at, okay, why did I think the way that I did? When we do premarital counseling here, Pastor Dave, when he's done, and I know Pastor Matt is teaching it now. But we'd have a moment we'd kind of share our own story of what relationships look like and what engagement looked like and the process of marriage. And we get this moment to be able to share what's one piece of advice you'd give to the couples who are getting married into the church. And I give two because I talk too much and have way too much to say. And I don't know if it's good, but I just say it anyway. And the first one I give is, especially in marriage, one of the first pieces of advice is, hey, remember the covenant. The vows that you made, continue to come back to them because it was a promise you made on the day, not only to your spouse, but to God himself. And then the second one is the majority of frustration and disappointment you will experience in life is because of unmet expectations that you carry and bring into that relationship. So we know what it means to be disappointed by expectations that are not met. And this is what the disciples are experiencing right now. Jesus is confronting and challenging certain expectations that they had about what it was going to look like for the Messiah, for the Anointed One, for Jesus himself to come and to save the world. They had a picture and a thought and an idea and a vision of here's what this is going to look like. Here's how Jesus is going to go about saving the world. And in their plan and in their thought and in their vision, it didn't have anything to do with Jesus dying. So listen, this is what Jesus says. He says, the Son of Man is going to be handed over into the hands of men. And a part of why the disciples had a certain expectation of how Jesus was going to go about saving the world is Jesus himself uses this title, Son of Man, for himself. We know from last week in Matthew 16, Jesus goes to the disciples and say, hey, who do the people say that I am? Well, some people say you're Elijah come back. Some people say you're Moses. And then Peter stands up and he declares confidently, because it's a revelation from God, that no, you are the Messiah, the anointed one, the saving one. You are the Son of the living God. And Jesus basically says, yeah, good for you. This was revealed to you of God. That is, basically, he confirms it. And the Messiah was the one who was going to come and literally save not only the Israelite people, but all of humanity from sin. And so when Jesus uses this, the title Son of Man, the disciples have certain ideas and expectations of what it looks like that the Son of Man is going to come to deliver and save the people. The Son of Man is not neutral language. It carries actually a ton of deep meaning. It comes from Daniel 7. A lot of Old Testament, but it comes from Daniel 7's vision of this person, of this figure who receives authority and glory and everlasting kingdom. You can go and throw up Daniel 7. This is verses 13, 14. So Daniel's saying, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. And then it goes on to say, he was given authority and glory and sovereign power. So this Son of Man was given all authority and all glory and all power. And it says all peoples, all nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And so when they hear Son of Man, and they had expectations of what it would look like for the Son of Man to come and save God's people and save humanity, it was this image. It was the Son of Man who's going to come with all authority and all glory and all sovereign power, and people were going to worship him. And that was going to be the immediate response when the Messiah was to come. So they said, when they hear Son of Man and when they think Son of Man and when they know Jesus is the Messiah and he confirms it, they're thinking, okay, God is going to, and Jesus is going to overthrow the powers that be now that are oppressing and making us suffer and making us experience pain. And that was the expectation that they had. But then Jesus says, but this Son of Man, me, I'm actually going to be delivered and handed over into the hands of men. And it just couldn't compute with the disciples. How could the Son of Man, the one, the Messiah, who's going to given all glory and power and dominion, that the nations were going to worship, how can that person be handed over, be literally given over, be delivered, be betrayed, be given into someone else's power? So instead of describing rising authority and influence and overtaking maybe the political power at hand in this moment, Jesus speaks about loss of control. And he speaks about suffering and a different path than the one the disciples expected. And because he gave a different path, he showed a different way in which God was going to go about redeeming the world, the disciples were left frustrated. The language is literally, they were left filled with grief. And I think in our relationship with Jesus and our relationship with God, there's a lot of time that we carry certain assumptions and expectations about what that relationship should look like. Assumptions about how God should guide us and speak to us, how he should protect us and provide for us. Assumptions that, man, if I'm just faithful and I show up every day, then I think we sometimes do, then how can anything really actually bad happen to me? And we sometimes know we have these assumptions or expectations because we go through hard moments and seasons in life and we sit back and we're like, that's not supposed to happen. I've been good, I've been faithful. Like, why is this happening to me? Because we had an expectation that we thought life was going to go a certain way, especially in our relationship with Jesus, that all of a sudden, there's just a different path. It's different than the one in maybe which we built up into our head that was supposed to happen. And that's the kind of tension that the disciples are feeling. He's describing a way and a path that is costly and is uncertain, at least for the disciples, even though he gives clarity on, I'm going to die, but I will be raised to life. And Matthew tells us the way that the disciples responded was with grief. Other versions of the Bible says that they were distressed. So point number 2 is this, is when our expectations get disrupted, distress, grief, frustration is often the first response. And what I love about Scripture, what I absolutely love about the Bible, is it does not take away from natural human experience. Is it continues to speak into, and I think invite us into being okay with experiencing hard things. I love that here in this moment, in the second prediction, that Matthew doesn't tell us a certain story of response like the first time when Peter stood up and heard that Jesus was going to suffer, and Peter said, "Not today, I will not let that happen." And then Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." It's here as no, they just felt massive grief, a ton of frustration. They felt literal distress, disappointment. Luke phrases it this way in chapter 9, verse 45. So they did not understand what this meant. It was hidden from them, so they didn't grasp it. And says they were afraid to ask him about it. There was so much disappointment and grief and frustration and distress that they couldn't even ask really follow-up questions like, "What do you mean you're going to die?" It was just immediate grief, immediate distress. And this reaction makes sense to us, right? If you've ever had moments in your life, experiences, relationships, a job that you thought was going to go away, you thought parenting maybe was going to go a certain way, you thought marriage was going to turn out a certain way, and when expectations that we have don't match up with reality, you go through disappointment. It's a natural reaction to experiencing something like this. The plan changes. Maybe a prayer is not answered in a certain way that you hoped. A door closes that you for sure thought was going to be open or stay open. In those moments, it's not unusual to feel really unsettled. The disciples had envisioned a visible kingdom, restored influence, forward movement. Instead, Jesus is talking about suffering and death. And I think there are multiple responses we can have when we experience this disappointment. And again, I love the fact that the Bible is okay. It's like, no, this is what they felt, and that's okay. What we feel in these moments of being disappointed, distressed, frustrated, lost, confused, the feeling is not bad. It's okay, how am I going to respond in this moment? And I think one typical response sometimes for us is we move toward withdrawal. We pull back relationally. We push down any emotion. We try to protect ourselves. We question whether God is really at work. Again, would be a natural response, depending on the severity of the expectation not being met. Makes sense. But I think there's also another response, one that God invites us into, and it's one of continuing to learn and allow it to be a place where our trust and our faith in Him and His purposes for us, even when we don't understand, can deepen and can grow. Again, I love that a life with Jesus doesn't pretend that these types of experiences and emotions aren't real or shouldn't exist. But when they happen, I think it is an invitation for us to learn how to remain with God in the middle of them. In 2011, so our first year of marriage, me and my wife knew that we were going to go to Minneapolis to help plant a church. And we went with the previous college young adult pastor who was the pastor of Oasis at the time. His name was Rick Whiff, and he was the lead pastor of this church plant. And he asked us to go along, and we said yes, and we knew we were going. And so we were here in Brookings for a year before we knew we were going to move to Minneapolis. And in the midst of that year, and even in the first few months of moving to Minneapolis, there was a lot of prayer and a lot of discernment and trying to ask God's direction on like, okay, where do we even plant this church? What is it going to look like? And in the midst of that, there's dreams and there's plans and there's thoughts and ideas. And at one point, like we had talked about what would it look like to multiply and to have other campuses and other church plants from us. And it was a fun season of just like, God, we're excited for what you're going to do, and we try to move faithfully in a certain direction. And we got advice, and I think it wasn't good or bad advice to start with monthly services. And so we lived there for, about 9 months before we had our first monthly service. And at the first service where we were meeting, we had like 75 people show up, and it was incredible. It was an awesome Sunday. It was a tight space, but like it was just a really good moment. And then before our next monthly service, which was going to be our Easter service on Easter Sunday, I think a week before or 2 weeks before that Easter service, we were told that we weren't going to be able to meet in the building that we were meeting in. And we had this long-term plan, and like we were going to be in this building for who knows how long. And so we were scrambling for a few weeks to try to figure out where are we going to have Easter service. Like the reason we come together when we celebrate Easter Sunday, Jesus has been resurrected. So you got to do service. It's like, where are we going to do it? And we did end up finding a place We ended up doing Easter service with about 15 people in a park at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it was so cold. And I'm sitting there, remember, like we had to wait before we could practice I was the worship leader, the music leader, but we had to wait before we could practice because there was noise ordinances and you couldn't make a lot of sound. We were practicing, but the drums couldn't start yet because if you hit the drums too loud, the neighbors were like, there's a noise ordinance. And I just remember sitting there like leading practice and like getting ready to come up like, this is not what I imagined. And there was frustration and disappointment. And I remember talking to Rick, who was my boss and my mentor and coach, and he was the lead pastor, and I just was like, I was frustrated and angry. And in the midst of that, I didn't know what was happening in my own soul. Like, man, I was grieving what I thought what was going to happen. I was grieving what I thought could be. That, man, I don't know if it's going to be. And I remember multiple times through this process, he was really patient and really gentle with me. And time again, he would say, yeah, I don't really know what God's doing here, but I know I can't walk away. I was like, well, fine. I'm glad you're there. I'm not there right now. And I come back and be angry and frustrated because my expectations of what I thought was going to happen, man, they were not met. And I go to him and say, yeah, I don't know what God's doing, but I know I can't leave yet. I'm going to keep just trying to be faithful to what he's asked us to do. And there's this core moment for me where, man, a moment when I have massive expectations of what I thought was going to happen didn't get met. An extreme disappointment. And I could have chosen to stay in bitterness and frustration and anger. And it was a season and a moment where God was asking me just to, hey, take a continual next step of faith, take a continual next step of faithfulness. And he was teaching me trust. And I come back to this day, like now, 12 years later, 13 years later, and say, yeah, I don't know what God was doing. I don't know what was happening. But I knew in the moment and the time he wasn't asking us to leave. So we stayed faithful. Sometimes when our plans of what we think life, when they don't match reality, when our expectations of what we think is going to happen don't happen, we can withdraw, we can make that choice, or we can choose to step in. We can choose to continue to be faithful. The disciples are discovering that following Jesus does not always mean understanding his purposes right away, because they continue to follow him, even in the midst of their grief, even in the midst of their distress, even when they don't understand fully what's happening. And sometimes when we experience this, it means continuing to walk with Jesus even while God's purposes are still unfolding, even when we don't have answers of what we think might happening. Because the truth is, and this is point number 3, is that Jesus holds suffering and resurrection together, teaching us to trust God's purpose in both. He gives them good news and bad news. He says, I will be handed over and they will kill me, and on the third day, I will be raised to life. The disciples in this moment didn't hear the good news. And in the midst of this, the disciples' perspective was suffering looked like failure and loss. It looked like the end of the story of what they thought God was going to do, not only for the Israelite people, but for the world. To say and to think and to hear Jesus saying he's going to go die sounded like everything that they had hoped for was about to collapse. But Jesus knew that, one, suffering had to happen, and we'll get a little into more of that next week, at least theologically, and why that matters for the forgiveness of our sin. But he knew that suffering also wasn't the final outcome. He knew that God would bring life through what was about to happen, that the cross was not a disruption to God's plan. It was a part of how he was bringing about redemption in the world. That's why I think Paul says in Romans 8, he says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. Is that there are moments in our life where we experience resurrection moments, like the highest of highs. And then there are moments in our life where we experience massive suffering. And it's in the midst of both of those things that God is laying out and fulfilling his purposes. I think we misunderstand sometimes Romans 8, where it says, we know that in all things God works for the good. And the verse is misunderstood. It doesn't mean that in every situation we experience, that the situation and the experience itself is good. But it also does not mean that suffering is simple or easy to explain. It means that God's purposes are not limited by our circumstances. Is that whether through resurrection moments or through suffering moments, the highest of highs or the lowest of lows, God is working out his purposes. That he is able to form growth and maturity out of disappointment and hardship. He uses seasons of uncertainty to deepen our dependence in him. I think the cross shows us this pattern, that for the disciples, it was massively uncertain and unknown. It didn't make any sense, and yet the cross was the thing. Jesus' death and shed blood was the thing that would ultimately bring out the greatest purpose of God, the complete saving and restoration of all humanity. And it was through suffering. And at the time, it didn't make sense to the disciples, yet they still chose to follow him to it. They still chose to see, and a couple of them to actually be witnesses to Jesus' death on the cross. And yet in their choosing to continue to follow Jesus, even for a few moments it looked like they abandoned him, that if they had not followed Jesus to the cross, I do not think that they would have seen or witnessed or been a witness to the resurrection. It's sometimes in those moments of hardship and difficulty where we choose to trust even when there's uncertainty and unanswered questions, where we allow ourselves to quietly persevere even when we don't have confidence of what's going on in the hard moments of life, in the suffering of life, that at some point we will be able to see and understand the resurrection answers, the purposes that God had for it, whether now in this life or in the one to come. And in the midst of all of it, he is working out his purposes. So the question then is like, okay, what does it actually look like to trust God when it's hard? When they're suffering, when it's difficult? And there was I think a few different ways I could have done this, and I just wanted to focus as we close this morning on looking at the example of Jesus. Because he knew what was happening and he knew what was coming. Is he knew he was going to go die. And he chose to faithfully trust the Father's plan of his death, knowing he was ultimately going to be risen. So point number 4 is this, is that Jesus models trust even when the path is costly and painful. So the disciples are distressed, right? They're trying to process what's happening here. They don't understand the suffering and how suffering and even like Messiah and Son of Man can belong in the same sentence. And Jesus knows they don't understand, which is why I think 2 more times in the Gospel of Matthew, he continues to come back to this prediction. He's trying to set them up to help them understand what's coming. But Jesus himself, in the midst of knowing he's going to death, he continues to move toward Jerusalem. He says in Matthew 16, what we learned last week, that he must go and suffer. He continues to teach and continues to entrust himself to the Father's purpose, even though he knows the path is leading toward death. I think the book of Hebrews gives us a few insights into the mind, into the mission of Jesus, of why he would choose to do this. One is in Hebrews 2:10, where he says, in bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. So that the suffering of Jesus was the very means by which salvation would be completed. The writer of Hebrews says this path was fitting for God. I mean, this path was the one in which God was always going to take. So God, who created all things, chose to bring redemption, not by avoiding suffering, but by entering into it. Jesus, the one who is the pioneer, the one who goes ahead of us and before us, walked the path of pain and rejection and death so that he could lead humanity into restored life and into the presence of God. His suffering was necessary because God knew it wasn't okay for him just to stand at a distance and try to explain suffering to us and the suffering that sin had brought. He knew he needed to come in and experience it and carry it. And so he chose to. And then a second thing, I think Hebrew gives us another insight into this, why Jesus did this. And it's Hebrews 12:2 that says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith, says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, sitting down at the right hand of the throne of God. The joy set before him was not, he was pleased and happy to go die. The joy set before him was us. Jesus completely understood what was accomplished through the humiliation of the cross. The joy set before him was he could see that redemption was going to come. He could see people, you and me, being brought into new life with him. That even though sin had broken the relationship that we have with God, it was suffering and the cross and the shedding of his blood that would fix, that would reconcile the relationship that was broken. And Jesus could see that, and that was the joy that was set before him. It didn't make the cross any easier, but he knew that God's purpose was larger than the pain he was going to experience. And Jesus didn't allow shame to deter him from going to it. The crucifixion was the most humiliating experience you could have. You were hanging on a wood cross naked, dying in front of people, and he chose to go to it because we were his joy, knowing we were going to be reconciled and brought back into relationship with God, knowing that that was going to forgive us of our sin and give us and have us experience freedom in this life. I think Jesus didn't only suffer for us. I think the path Jesus takes, the choices he makes to lead and go through and walk through that pain and that suffering, I think shows us how to trust God even when the path is painful, even when it's costly. As we close this morning, three things. Three just reflection questions to take with you this week. And next week and the next 2 weeks, we're going to dive deeper into this idea of the shedding of the blood of the cross and what forgiveness looks like and why that was important and what that looked like. But for today, the first question is this: where are there moments in your life where you're feeling the weight of uncertainty? Are there moments in your life right now, like situations that you sense that something may be unfolding, something may be happening, but you don't fully understand what it means? Or maybe you don't even understand. Like you just are in a situation or a moment or an experience like I'm in this painful path moment. I'm experiencing suffering. There's heaviness, there's weight, there's uncertainty because I don't have answers. I don't know what's coming about. I think a part of processing, a part of stepping into trust of following Jesus in those moments is just to name it. Name the grief, name the disappointment, name the frustration, name the season. What is happening? And then as you name it, you move into this next aspect of reflection where, okay, then how might certain expectations you have be shaping the way that you see the season that you're in? In the midst of maybe the circumstance or moment that you're in, or maybe now you are experiencing resurrection life and resurrection moments, but suffering probably is going to come. There's going to be aspects of pain or disappointment that's going to happen. And so yes, you name it, but then also, are there assumptions maybe that you're carrying or that we do carry in hard and difficult moments about how God should work? There's expectations or assumptions that we're making about, okay, God, this is happening right now and this is really difficult, so why aren't you moving in this way? Why aren't you healing? Why aren't you answering the prayer in the way in which I want you to answer the prayer? What are some expectations or your assumptions you're making about God? Get them out. And then, what would it look like to stay close to Jesus even before you have answers? To take just that next step of faith and faithfulness, believing that God's purposes are being accomplished, even when it doesn't make sense. I think from this moment in Matthew 17, the disciples walked with Jesus, like that day, probably carrying more questions than having clarity that they maybe wanted, but they chose to stay with him. And because they stayed, they eventually saw the resurrection. There's a reality where you may not understand everything that is happening in your life now or everything that God is doing right now, but I pray that we together could have the faith and the trust to continue to choose to stay close to Jesus. A lot of times understanding and clarity of what was happening in a hard moment comes later, and so we now choose to trust, believing he's working out his purpose. Father, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for the privilege it is to be able to gather, yes, in person, but also those that are watching online. How crazy and cool is that, God? That you've given us this ability, that we are in a time and a season that we get to gather and to worship you through music and prayer and the reading and hearing of your word. God, I'm again really thankful for just this kind of insight into the disciples' life I think this invitation even this morning that, man, it's really okay to grieve and to feel disappointment and frustration and distress. And there are people watching online, people now in this room that are going through moments that are on a path right now that feels like just suffering and just pain. And so I do ask, God, would you meet them where they are at? And would you do what you can do, Holy Spirit, as our comforter, and would you comfort them? Would you, God of peace, extend your peace mightily to them? Would you continue to extend grace, and a grace that maybe doesn't give answers to what we're experiencing or what we're going through now in the moment, but a grace that allows us and gives us power to continue to persevere through the hard things of life. Jesus, I don't think I'll ever fully be able to understand or grasp that we are the joy that was set before you. That you chose shame and humiliation that wasn't yours. That wasn't yours to bear or wasn't yours to choose, knowing that at the other side of that, we would be able to come back and be embraced by you. Man, may that encourage us as we leave this place. May that encourage us as we continue to try to choose to trust and walk in faith, even in hard things. Thank you, Jesus, for going to the cross. Continue to give us clarity on what that looks like and what that means. And where there's not clarity in the things that we are going through, God, I ask for faith. And I ask for increased trust. To take what maybe is or feels really hard, a next step of faithfulness, a next step of trust, a next step of faith. Man, would you give us that power to do so? I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. You guys go ahead and stand.